Hi, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Revelation, session 10, session 11. I pray that this will be of benefit to you and help you in your studies. Thank you. All right, so we're looking at session 11. We're looking at chapters 10, verse 1 to chapter 11, verse 2. And last week we started the trumpet judgments. Remember the seal and trumpet judgments and the first half of the tribulation. So last week we saw the first seal judgment was opened, and in the first seal judgment we had 1/3 of the dry land being destroyed. And second trumpet judgment, the second trumpet judgment, we had 1/3 of the salt water being destroyed and the life in the sea being destroyed. In the third trumpet judgment, we had 1/3 of the fresh waters being destroyed. And then we had in the fourth trumpet judgment, we had 1/3 of the light source not shining on the earth. 1/3 of the light source was lost. And then, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4. In the fifth, sixth, and seventh trumpet judgments are called the Woe Judgements. There are 3 Woe Judgments. The fifth trumpet was the first Woe Judgment, and at that time we saw a fallen angel got the key to the abyss, opened up the abyss, and we had this demonic invasion hitting the earth. And they tormented men for 5 months, so much so that there was such torment that even when men wanted to die, they couldn't take their own lives. It was a judgment. And then in the sixth trumpet, which was the second Woe Judgment, we now see another demonic invasion, attack, and 1/3 of the rest of humanity is now killed. So at this point in time, half the world's population is now gone, because we saw 1/4 of the world's population destroyed in the seal judgments, and now we have 1/3 of what's left being destroyed in the sixth trumpet judgment. We haven't opened the seventh trumpet yet, or haven't blown the seventh trumpet yet. The seventh trumpet is the last Woe Judgment, and that's what we're gonna get to that. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Oh, I put the slide in there for you from that wasn't on your slides last week, so this is just to fill your gap from last week. Okay, now we're into chapter 10, and we're into the little book. It's a little book, and now John received at this point he receives the longest vision in the book of Revelation. We don't see the words "I saw" again until chapter 13, verse 1. And in this section, we have the longest break between judgments, between the sixth trumpet judgment and the seventh trumpet judgment being blown. So this is the longest break we see. And so remember, between the sixth and seventh seal judgments, we saw the sealing of the 144,000 Jewish evangelists, and we saw salvation of a great multitude. But here, between the sixth and seventh trumpet, we're going to see a number of revelations before the last trumpet is sounded. In chapter 10, John is now introduced to what he'll have to prophesy in the course of the later half of his book. In verses 1 to 4, he sees another vision. And I saw another strong angel coming down out of heaven, arrayed with a cloud. And the rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little book open. And he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot upon the earth. Verse 3. And he cried with a great voice as a lion roareth. And when he cried, the 7 thunders uttered their voices. And when the 7 thunders uttered their voices, I was about to write, And I heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up the things which the seven thunders uttered and write them not. So these are the first 4 verses of chapter 10. And this is now, John is now looking at the longest vision that he'll have here. So we got a little bit of peace and quiet in the experience of John in the visions he now sees. There's this break. So he sees a strong angel, and this particular angel has a little book or a little scroll. It's a bibliaridion in Greek, a bibliaridion, which means it's a little book. This is the second scroll that we've seen mentioned in Revelation. The last one was the 7 seals scroll, which is a biblios, and that was back in chapter 5. Now, the second scroll comes into the picture, and we're going to see the content of this second scroll shortly. Now, John, as he's visualizing the scene he sees, the 7 thunders utter their voice, and what they say is audible and understandable, because, you know, John, he understands what they're saying because he was going to try to record what they were saying. But he's now forbidden to record it. And to this day, we don't know what the 7 thunders uttered, but I can guarantee lots of commentators would probably say what they think it's uttered. Anyway, it was sealed up. It was not to be revealed beyond the knowledge of John. So John was forbidden to write it down. He wasn't allowed to tell us, so no one has any idea what the 7 thunders said at this time. Back to the angel. This is another strong angel. It's simply saying that he's different to the 7 trumpet angels. It's another angel. And we see the descriptions here of this angel. They're actually very similar to the descriptions that we see of the Lord Jesus in chapter 1. We see the descent in a cloud, chapter 1, verse 7. We see the face as the sun in chapter 1, verse 16. We see the feet as pillars of fire in chapter 1, verse 15. And we see the planting of his feet in an act of possession. And this comes from 1 Corinthians 10, verse 26, where it says, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So all of these point to the angel being Christ. However, but an angel might also have these characteristics. And here he's called a strong angel, the same as one back in chapter 5, verse 2. And in actual fact, in Daniel chapter 10, verses 5 to 6, we also see another angel with similar characteristics. And back there it says, his body also was like the beryl, and his face as the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as flaming torches, his arms and his feet like unto burnished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. So, something else here. The archangel Michael's name means who is like God, which would make these characteristics not unexpected. Also, we have another big problem here, because this angel has come to earth, and it would make it it would seem a bit strange with the angel, if the angel was Jesus coming to earth at this point in the book. So it's not Jesus. It's simply another angel. So what we see here is it back in chapter 1, Jesus is introduced as a judge and the executor of vengeance against wrongdoers, but he also deals in mercy and in righteousness with his people. And in the tribulation, he deals with the world in absolute righteousness and justice. So it's best to look at this angel as in the plain sense of the word angel, and understand that he is a mighty and powerful angel dispatched by God for a specific purpose. Well, that was a long time in that angel, wasn't it? Anyway, okay, let's move on. Now, so far we've had 6 of the 7 trumpets sounded. Remember, the trumpets are the second series of judgments. So we have 1 more remaining. And the results of the 7th trumpet are now announced by the strong angel in verses 5 to 7. And the angel that I saw standing upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his right hand to heaven and sware by him that liveth for ever and ever, who created the heaven and the things that are therein, and the earth and the things that are therein, and the sea and the things that are therein, that there shall be delay no longer. But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he's about to sound, then is finished the mystery of God, according to the good tidings which he declared to his servants, the prophets. So, what's all this mean? At this point, the angel announces to John what is going to be the result of the seventh trumpet judgment. The seventh trumpet judgment will contain, we're going to see before too long, the 7 bowl judgments. So when the seventh trumpet sounds, it's going to bring forth the 7 bowl judgments. And by means of the 7 bowl judgments, the mystery of God will be finished, which he declared to his prophets. So what's he saying? What he's saying here is this, that the various prophecies of the Old Testament, and there are lots of prophecies, in the Old Testament, they prophesied concerning the events of the Great Tribulation. Also, lots of the minor prophets also were especially concerned with the Great Tribulation. And it is with this 7th trumpet containing the 7 bowl judgments that we're going to see that the fulfillment of all that the prophets spoke about concerning the period of the Great Tribulation. It's all going to come to its end. And now the bowl judgments contained in the 7th trumpet judgment will bring to a conclusion God's program of the tribulation. So the 7th trumpet will not be all at once judgment, but it's going to be a process. It's going to be a process, well, a series of judgments. And it's evident from the statement, in the days of the voice of the 7th angel is the mystery of God finished. You see, it says days, it's plural. So it shows us that there's a time period involved in these 7 bowl judgments. Okay, so this strong angel lifted up his right hand to heaven as he stood upon the land and the sea, and swear by him that liveth for ever and ever. The angel's posture here is that of a conqueror taking possession of his territory. He's claiming the whole world to the one he's swearing to. One he's swearing to is God. And what we see here is that back in Joshua chapter 1 verse 3, it says, every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, to you have I given it, as I spoke unto Moses. So God's telling Joshua. So the feet upon the earth and on the sea, it's claiming the whole lot. And what he says here is there's going to be no delay. There shall be delay no longer. Now, this word delay has 2 meanings. It can be time, or it can be simply be delay. And whenever a word has 2 or more meanings, we need to take it in the context in which we find it. And in the context of what we find here, it would mean delay, simply because we know that there's still 3.5 years to go. There's 3.5 years left of the tribulation to run, and we also know that there's 1,000 years after that. So it simply is a delay. All right? No delay. It's going to happen. And the reason the angel says that there'll be delay no longer is that when the 7th angel sounds his trumpet, when he blows that trumpet, then is finished the mystery of God. God has been delaying his judgments so that lost sinners will have time to repent. And this is according to 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 to 9. But now he will accelerate his judgments, and he'll accomplish his purposes. He's bringing it to an end. And so now we're going to know that there's one more trumpet to sound, and that's going to bring forth the completion of the wrath of God. So events are going to move forward rapidly, and the culmination will be the extinction, the total extinction of all civilization that is built up by man. So the seventh trumpet, which hasn't been blown yet, the seventh trumpet contains the 7 bowl judgments, and this is the third woe. We had one, we had trumpet 5, first woe, trumpet 6, second woe, and they got worse and worse. And now we have the third woe, which is the 7th trumpet being blown, which holds the 7 bowl judgments. And this is the worst of all because it contains those bowl judgments. So the little book back in chapter 1 and 2 of John 10, the little book contains all the information regarding the 7th trumpet with the bowl judgments. And we're going to see all of that happening in Revelation 15 and 16. Okay, hopefully you got all that. Okay, now, the content of the little book is prophecy, especially the prophecy of the middle and the second half of the tribulation. So the next center of attention in this chapter, of chapter 10, verse 8 to 10, is the little book or the scroll in the angel's hand. Verse 8, and the voice which I heard from heaven, I heard it again speaking with me and saying, go, take the book which is open in the hand of the angel that standeth upon the sea and upon the earth. And I went unto the angel, saying unto him that he should give me the little book. And he said unto me, take it and eat it up, and it shall make thy belly bitter, but in thy mouth it shall be sweet as honey. And I took the little book out of his hand, the angel's hand, and ate it up. And as it was in my mouth, sweet as honey, and when I had eaten it, my belly was made bitter. It's a bit like my lunch today. Anyway, so the first scroll, which we saw in chapter 5, contained the first scroll, which was the beginning of the tribulation, contained chapters 6 to 22. Now, this particular scroll, John is commissioned to take it and to eat it. He's also told the effects of his eating will have. As he eats this book in his mouth, it's going to be sweet as honey. But when it gets down to his belly, it's going to make him bitter. And this is a symbolic act of John, which he was commanded to perform. And this strong angel handed the open book to John, instructing him to eat it, which he did. And so what we see here is that the open book apparently contained revelations from God. And it included some of the things John was about to write so that they would be revealed to us. And in John's mouth, it was sweet as honey, but in his stomach, it became bitter, which is exactly what the angel said was going to happen. Now, is this the only time we've seen this in the scriptures? No, not at all. This is not the only time we've seen it, because back in Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 8 to chapter 3, verse 3, Ezekiel also had to eat a roll of a book which was handed to him. And Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 15, 16 to 18, he did the same thing. Now, you and I know that God's word is compared to food. We see bread in Matthew 4:4, milk in 1 Peter 2:2, meat in 1 Corinthians 3:1 to 2, and honey in Psalm 119, verse 103. So it's compared, God's word is compared to food: bread, milk, meat, honey. The prophets, Ezekiel and Jeremiah, knew what it was to eat the word before they could share it with others. The word must always become flesh before it can be given to those who need it. So what are we talking about? What are we talking about? the key to understanding what is meant here is in verse 11. And they say unto me, thou must prophesy again over many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. So verse 11 gives us the content of what is inside the little book. And the little book contains further prophecies regarding the events of the middle and the second half of the tribulation. And the knowledge of the events contained in the book, as John eats the book, it's going to be sweet to his mouth, but when he digests it, it's going to be bitter to his stomach. You and I, we eat food, we chew it, we swallow it, we digest it, and finally we assimilate it into our body. Some of it is built into our tissues, so we have life is sustained. Sometimes, you find a good book and you say, oh, I devoured that book. You didn't really eat the book. What you did was you meant that you studied the book and you received mental food and nourishment from it as if it were actual food. And this is the same thing here. Sometimes that which is eaten physically proves to be very bitter and harmful to us. And the point of this chapter here, because remember, John is given this little book which contains prophecy, right? And the point of this chapter is that the study of eschatology or prophecy, eschatology, study of the last days, the doctrine of the last days, or prophecy, it can be sweet to the mouth. It's wonderful finding out the prophecy. It's just marvelous. People out there, they just want to know prophecy. If you have a new book about prophecy coming out, they'll buy that rather than a new book about other theology. If you have a prophetic conferences, they'll flock to prophetic conferences. You have a conference on prayer, conference on prophecy. Oh yeah, we'll go to that, right? Same thing here. It's sweet to the mouth. Oh, it's just wonderful. It's sweet to the mouth. There's a certain pleasure that we derive from knowing about the future and what will happen in the future. And we talk about it all the time. But if we simply know about the future and talk about it and don't assimilate it, don't chew it over, what's going to happen is that we actually fail to apply the prophecy where it should be applied. What we should do is we should virtually digest the teachings of the word regarding prophecy, eschatology, and it should have the same effect on us as it did to John. There should be an element of bitterness, or actually the word can mean heaviness or sadness. So there should be an element of sadness or heaviness when we read prophecy. And the heaviness that should develop what we should be concerned about. It's concerning the knowledge that we have, because if we fully understand the teaching of Scripture in relationship to the rapture or the tribulation, and that all believers will escape this period by means of the rapture, if that should do anything, it should make us more fervent in wanting to get the message of the gospel out to unsaved people, because this for them is the only way of escape. But if we're simply excited in the knowledge that we have of what we have of prophecy, and it doesn't have any practical effects on our life, if that is all it is, if it's just simply sweet to our mouth, it hasn't done the job. It hasn't done the job, because prophecy should be sweet to the mouth, but when we digest it, it should be bitter to our bellies, right? Because what it should do, it should cause us to live a lifestyle that is now in keeping with the Scriptures. Unless it causes us to be concerned for the unsaved around us, it hasn't really done its job. Whoa, I know what's coming in the future. Wow, isn't it exciting? What are you doing about it? Well, I'm just waiting for the future. No. In 2 Peter 3, Peter writes concerning the end of the heavens and the earth. 2 Peter 3. And how this earth and this planet is going to be burned up. But then he says to the Christians to whom he's writing, although they won't be there at the time anyway when it happens, what he's saying is, what manner of life should we then lead, or how should we then live in light of the fact that we know of the coming end of and destruction of this planet? How should we be living? We should walk, this Peter says, we should walk in all manner of godliness. So Peter's message is the message of Revelation chapter 10 as well. What prophecy should do is cause us to lead a lifestyle in conformity with the knowledge that we've received. Again, it means to be heavy or concerned for those who are not saved. You remember back when we spoke about the 144,000 Jews of chapter 7? They're going to be the evangelists of the tribulation. The question arises, well, since the church will be raptured, well, how are they going to know? How will they hear the gospel? Well, you know what? I know lots of folk who host is young Jewish backpackers, right? And they all share the gospel with them. You know, we're all going to be raptured, but there's going to be these guys and many like these folk around who are left behind, who will either have a Gideon's Bible or they'll remember what some of the body of Christ told them about the future. And so, you know, they would have heard the gospel from church saints, but they didn't accept it at the time. But when the rapture comes, you know, it's going to be brought to their remembrance, and possibly then they'll accept the gospel and then begin preaching. So that's one practical area that prophecy should help us out. It should definitely move us towards witnessing to Jewish people, because it's the Jewish person you're witnessing to today could be one of those 144,000 in the witnessing in the tribulation. Who knows? Who knows? But prophecy should move us toward that point. We should be fervent in sharing Jesus, especially with young Jewish folk. Anyway, all right, we're going to digress just a little bit. We're going to look at Daniel. Daniel is in the Old Testament, right? It's Daniel was in Babylon. Just some background events that are taking place in the midpoint of the tribulation. In Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 to 39, I'm going to quickly just go through this. In Daniel 11, 36 to 39, we have a description of the Antichrist. And in verses 40 to 45, Daniel 11 describes certain events which will transpire or which happen during the middle of the tribulation. And this is in conjunction with the second of the 3 world wars. Remember, there's 3 world wars in the 7-year period. And so this is in conjunction with the Second World War in the 7-year period. We're going to look at this further in chapter 13 when we get there. But I'm just giving you some background here. Whatever kind of peace, remember, Antichrist signed a 7-year covenant guaranteeing peace to the Jewish people. And whatever kind of peace he guaranteed between the Antichrist, and remember also at this period of time, the world is separated into 10 dominions, 10 kings ruling the 10 kingdoms of the world. And the midpoint of the tribulation, we saw him back in the first seal. He started to move out in conquest. But now he moves out to take political control of the world in the midpoint. So the second worldwide conflict of the tribulation begins with the Antichrist declaring war on the 10 kings. Daniel 11:40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south contend with him, the Antichrist, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass through. 41. He shall also enter into the glorious land, Israel, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But the tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, and he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to sweep them many away. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Okay. At the time of the end, shall the king of the south contend with him, the Antichrist. That's the Antichrist. In his war, this Antichrist war against the 10 kings, the Antichrist moves out in all directions in conquest, and he moves against the north, the south, and the east. The 3 kings he will succeed in killing. We see that back in Daniel 7, verses 8, 20, and 24. I know this is a bit of history for you, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a picture. All right. So the 3 kings he will succeed in killing will be the king of the north, Syria, king of the south, Egypt, and the king of the east, Mesopotamia. And his conquest of Egypt opens up the door to go into Africa. He'll also invade Israel. Remember, everything revolves around Israel. How does world events affect Israel? That's what we need to worry about. So he'll also invade Israel, the glorious land. And he now sets the stage for the abomination of desolation. Remember, we're talking about the midpoint of the tribulation here. And we're going to see it later in this chapter. So in the middle of the tribulation, as the Antichrist moves out to consolidate world power, he'll begin to move towards consolidating both political and religious world authority. And involved in this, there will be an invasion of the glorious land in which the country is invaded, and he takes over at least a segment of this country. And the glorious land is who? It's Israel. Although eventually the Antichrist will gain political control of the whole world, 3 countries will escape his domination: Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Why? What's so special about these 3 countries? All of the 3 ancient nations are under one government today, the Kingdom of Jordan. Why Jordan escapes the domination, we'll see in chapter 13, but you should know anyway. Where's Petra? In Jordan. Oh, hang on. I put it for you on the slide. Bozrah or Petra is in Jordan. And that's where the Jews will be in hiding. So he doesn't have authority over this area. In verse 45 of Daniel 11, Daniel states where the Antichrist will plant his headquarters during the mid-tribulation war. And literal translation is this: he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas at the glorious holy mountain. The word for tent is refers to a military tent of a general, and the word for palace to a royal tent. So what we see here is that it's a royal tent of a military general, the Antichrist, that is set up. And it's set up between the seas. What seas? Well, one of them is the Mediterranean Sea on the western coast of Israel, and the other is the Dead Sea on the eastern side of the glorious holy mountain. This glorious holy mountain, what's that? That's the Temple Mount, or Mount Moriah, or Mount Zion. And so he's going to set up his tent on the mountain between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. And this is going to set the stage for consolidating both political and religious control of the world. It says he shall plant the tents of his palace between the sea and glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. So it's apparently during this conflict that the Antichrist is killed. And it says he shall come to his, this is verse 45, Daniel 11, he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 3, the death of the Antichrist is stated as, and I saw one of his heads as though it had been smitten unto death, and his death stroke was healed, and the whole earth wondered after the beast. We're going to get to the heads later on, but the 7th head, which is the Antichrist, is smitten unto death. where it says as though it had been smitten unto death, it simply doesn't mean he got a bit of a box over the ears. It means he was killed. It's also used of Jesus in Revelation 5:6. Jesus was smitten unto death. It means he was killed. It's an idiom for a resurrected individual, and a real death is involved. So in the course of the conflict between the Antichrist and the other 10 kings, or the 10 world rulers at that point in time, the Antichrist is killed. Remember, the Antichrist is part of the counterfeit Trinity, and the things when just as Jesus was killed and resurrected, so the Antichrist is killed and resurrected. He is the counterfeit. All right. Back to Revelation 11. Revelation 11, verses 1 to 2. We're going to look at the Tribulation Temple. And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and one said, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein. So why did God tell John to measure the temple and its worshippers? The measuring is to make known the fact that the temple and all its services and worshippers are not coming up to the standard acceptable to God. So the measuring reveals the deficiency and the failure of the worshippers. And this will be done to justify God not sanctioning the temple. Similar thing happened back in 2 Kings 21, verses 10 to 15, when God used the plummet, the plummet line to measure Samaria because of the wickedness of the house of Ahab. And there he destroyed Ahab's house. In Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48, especially chapter 40, verse 3, we see a man measuring the temple in Jerusalem, which were being shown to Ezekiel in a vision. And this measuring was to make known to the prophet the exact dimensions of the most glorious structure of the millennial temple, to be known as the house of prayer. And that temple is not the one in this passage, right? This temple is the different one. Now, which temple is this one? We need to get a better understanding. This is just some background stuff to mid-tribulation. To get a better understanding of what is happening at this stage in relationship to the temple, we need to go back to Isaiah 66. Remember, one of the good things about the book of Revelation is that we get to know some of the Old Testament books better. Back to Isaiah 66, verses 1 to 4. Thus says Jehovah, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Isaiah 66, 1 to 4. What manner of house will you build unto me? And what place shall be my rest? For all these things hath my hand made, and so all these things came to be, saith Jehovah. But to this man will I look, even to him that is poor and of a contrite spirit, and that trembleth at my word. Verse 3. He that killeth an ox is as he that slayeth a man. He that sacrificeth a lamb as he that breaketh a dog's neck. He that offereth an oblation as he that offereth swine's blood. He that burneth frankincense as he that blesseth an idol. Yes, they have chosen their own ways, and their souls delight in their abominations. I will also, this is God speaking now, I will also choose their delusions and will bring their fears upon them. Because when I called, none did answer. When I spake, they did not hear. But they did that which was evil in mine eyes, and chose that wherein I delighted not. Okay, what's this all about? As Isaiah gives his prophecy in chapter 66, he's talking about a house or a temple that the Jews are building that God refuses to sanction. Now, there are 4 Jewish temples, right? Of the 4 Jewish temples the Bible speaks about, there is only one temple that this could be true of. it could not be true of the first temple, the Solomonic temple, because God did sanction it. It cannot be true of the second temple, which was built by Zerubbabel and rebuilt by Herod the Great, because God did sanction the second temple. It cannot be the fourth temple of the kingdom in the millennium, because God himself will be involved in the rebuilding of the fourth temple of the millennium, or the Messianic kingdom. And therefore, it too is sanctioned by God. So it leaves a temple, a third temple, which God does not sanction. Now, Isaiah 66 speaks of a temple which God refuses to sanction. So we have to conclude that the only one temple left that will fit this description is the temple of the Great Tribulation period. So sometime either before the tribulation begins or during the first half of the tribulation, Israel will rebuild the Jewish temple, but it's going to be a building that God does not sanction. And Isaiah goes on to say that God will under no circumstances accept the sacrifices in this temple. So this passage in Isaiah 66, 1-4, begins with a protest from God, who makes it very clear in verse 1 that no house that Israel builds at this time will be acceptable. For God will not come and reside in it as he resided in the first temple, and he will reside again in the fourth temple. And according to verse 2, what God will require this time is not a new house, but faith. And in verse 3, he declares that he will not accept sacrifices. If they offer a lamb in accordance with the Mosaic law, God will reckon as if they were offering swine, which was forbidden by the Mosaic law. No kind of sacrifice, no matter how much in keeping with the Mosaic law, will be acceptable in the sacrifices of the third temple. And the very fact that they'll build this temple shows their failure in verse 4 of Isaiah 66 to listen to God's word and come to God through faith in Jesus the Messiah. Then in verse 5, we didn't read it, but Isaiah has a word of encouragement to those faithful Jews who will not participate in the rebuilding of the temple, but who are seeking to do God's will. So we know there's going to be a faithful remnant who will not participate or be involved in the rebuilding of the Jewish temple for the Great Tribulation period. And finally, in Isaiah 66, verse 6, Isaiah says that this new temple will result only in judgment. And this temple will not result in the forgiveness of sin. It will not result in acceptable worship. It will result only in judgment from God. One thing we know for certain, the third temple will be built either before the tribulation begins or sometime during the first half, because by the middle of the tribulation, the temple is standing and functioning. It has to be there functioning by the middle of the tribulation. Back to Revelation 11, verse 2. I'm giving you a bit of background, okay? Just a bit of background. And the court, this is a temple court, the court which is without the temple, leave without, and measure it not. For it hath been given unto the nations, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. So the outer court of the Gentiles is not measured. Instead, John is told to leave it out. And the language here indicates total rejection, and the reason is given because the Gentiles will tread underfoot the city of Jerusalem for 42 months. Now, how long is 42 months? 3.5 years. And this is going to occur during the last part of the tribulation, when the man of sin, the Antichrist, overthrows Jewish worship and demands worship of himself. Back in Luke 21, verse 24, it says, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Remember, the times of the Gentiles was from when Babylon began to destroy Judah and Jerusalem back in 606, and they finally burnt the temple in 586 BC, and it's going to go from that point of time till when Jesus returns to deliver the holy city and to redeem Israel. And we see that in Zechariah 14. So, the functioning worship of the temple described in chapter 11, verse 1 of Revelation occurs during the first part of the tribulation, whereas the treading down of the city by the Gentiles, 11:2, follows during the last 42 months or 1,260 days. Hey. Okay. All right. What is the cause? What is the cause of the treading down of Jerusalem? Let's go back to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. 27. It says, Daniel chapter 9, 27, and he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And upon the wing of abominations shall come one that maketh desolate. And even unto the full end, and that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. Yeah, we looked at this a couple of weeks ago as to the event that begins the tribulation. It was a signing of the 7-year covenant, the 7-year peace deal between the one who will be identified as the Antichrist and some of the leadership of Israel. But now the emphasis is what happens with the breaking of the covenant in the middle of the tribulation. The covenant that was signed began the 7 years of tribulation. However, according to this passage, it's not going to last, because the covenant itself will not last 7 years, because halfway through, in the midst of the week, in the midpoint of the 7 years, it is broken. And in conjunction with Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, what we see is that the Antichrist, when he invades the glorious land and takes over the Jewish temple, according to Revelation 11, 1-2, he's going to force the Jews to cease sacrificing, because he'll have his own purpose for this temple. And the purpose the Antichrist has for the temple is what the scriptures refer to when they talk about the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation. We're gonna cover a bit of that later on. Now, back in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. Now, listen, by the way, the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, they're like bookends of eschatology. You know, they're like the bookends, you know. You need to understand both of those books. Okay, Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. And from the time that the continual burnt offering shall be taken away, this is Daniel prophesying coming in the future, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. But we know that the last half of the tribulation is a total of 1,260 days. Yet we're told by Daniel that the abomination of desolation, whatever that is, the script, we're going to look at it later on. So far, it hasn't told us what it is, but we'll find out. What it says is that from the time that the abomination of desolation is set up, it's going to continue throughout the second half of the tribulation and for 30 days beyond the end of the tribulation. So, while the second half of the tribulation will end after 1,260 days, the abomination of desolation will be allowed to continue to stand up until the 1,290th day, or 30 days beyond the tribulation itself. Now, we do know that there is a 75-day interval between the end of the tribulation and the beginning of the messianic or kingdom, or the millennial kingdom. And during the first 30 days of this 75-day interval, the abomination of desolation will be allowed to continue standing. Matthew 24, verses 15 to 16, he says, When therefore you see the abomination, this is Jesus, when therefore you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, which you just looked at, standing in the holy place, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that are in Judea flee unto the mountains. Jesus says that when the abomination of desolation occurs as spoken by Daniel the prophet in the passage we just looked at, when that happens, that is a sign for the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, to get out of the land. Get out of Israel as quick as you can. There's a rapidity or an urgency about it. They've got to get it as quick as they can. And we're going to come back to these verses when we get later on, but this is just an overview. The main point to note is that the abomination of desolation, whatever that is, it's to serve as a warning sign to Israel to flee the land. Get out. All right. Now, so far we've looked at passages that have stated the coming of the abomination of desolation. And that is, what's it for? It's to serve as a warning sign to Israel, and it's going to be allowed to continue into the first 30 days of the interval between the tribulation end and the start of the millennium. But what we don't know so far is exactly what is the abomination of desolation. We're going to see that there's actually two stages to the abomination of desolation. First stage is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 to 4. Paul is writing, he says, let no man beguile you in any wise, for it'll not be except the falling away come first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. He that opposes and exalted himself against all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sitteth in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. This is the first stage of the abomination of desolation. It's the Antichrist taking over the Jewish temple as prophesied by Daniel in Daniel 9:27 and in accordance with Revelation 11 verses 1 to 2. He's going to seat himself in the Holy of Holies of this Jewish temple, and then he's going to declare himself to be the one true God. So, as he invades the glorious land, Israel, according to Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, one of his actions is to take over the Jewish temple. The Jewish temple will remain in Gentile control, trodden down under the Gentiles for 42 months, which is equivalent to 3.5 years. The last 3.5 years of the tribulation, the second half. And there's going to be a second stage of the abomination of desolation in chapter 13. But we're not going to tell you about that now. We're just looking at the first stage here. The first stage is the Antichrist seating himself in the temple of God, setting himself forth to be God. And this will be picked up again when we get to Revelation chapter 13. Whew. Okay. Just as in Matthew 24, verses 15 to 16, this incident is also going to serve as a revelation. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 8 to 12, and then shall be revealed the lawless one, whom the Lord Jesus shall slay with the breath of his mouth, and bring to naught by the manifestation of his coming. Even he whose coming is according to the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceit of unrighteousness for them that perish, because they received not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God sendeth them a working of error, that they should believe a lie, that they might all be judged who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So according to verse 8 of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it is at this point, when the Antichrist seats himself in the Holy of Holies, that his real, true character is going to be revealed to the Jewish people. In this chapter of 2 Thessalonians, Paul speaks of two revelations concerning the Antichrist. First revelation is in verse 3, which comes before the tribulation, and the first revelation is to believers living before the tribulation as to his identity. The second revelation, which will occur in the middle of the tribulation, will be for the Jewish nation according to Matthew 24, verse 15 to 16. And that is to reveal to Israel the true character of the man with whom they have entered into a covenant. And at this point, the first stage of the abomination of desolation has now occurred. And so Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 to 2, is the first stage, and we're going to talk about the second stage of the abomination of desolation when we get to chapter 13. And that is our lot for tonight. If you need any questions answered, you can contact us in any of these ways on the screen. Feel free to contact us. If I can help, I will help.